I don't think he understood what he was doing. He liked talking to big guys. You know, big guys get together and they do big guy things.
But you did accept it for 17 months, didn't you? Why so long?
The principal way you remove presidents is by elections, not by impeachment.
4 months to go till the presidential elections in America. Donald Trump is sinking in the polls, and now his former national security advisor says he isn't fit to be president anyway. In a new book, John Bolton, a long-serving big beast of the Republican Party, accuses Mr. Trump of a litany of incompetence and obstruction of justice. Mr. Bolton is my guest this week from Washington. How much damage have Trump and Bolton done to America and the rest of the world? John Bolton, welcome to Conflict Zone.
Glad to be with you. Thank you for having me.
When you became Donald Trump's national security advisor, you wrote that you thought you knew what you were getting yourself into. If that's true, why work for and give your loyalty to a man labeled as a serial liar?
Well, I viewed the loyalty that I owed and that I tried to live up to the Constitution and the country. You know, we're not a medieval society. You don't have a liege lord that you owe personal loyalty to. It's not the mafia or something like that. And the fact was, in my view, the country faced some serious challenges. I think a number of national security policies during the Obama administration had been misguided. There was a chance to make a contribution. I certainly went in with my eyes open, but I believed, at least at that time, that we could have a more regular process, a more typical, if you will, Republican administration. And notwithstanding the risks, I thought they were worth taking.
And the risks, did they include the honesty and integrity of the president, or lack of it? Didn't that matter to you?
Well, it remained to be seen, as far as I was concerned, how much of this was campaign rhetoric by the opposition. I had, as I recount in the book, a number of conversations with Donald Trump before the election, during the transition in his first year in office. We talked about all of my views on the key issues. He had watched me on Fox News for nearly 10 years. I assumed he was listening to what I was saying. I certainly wasn't shy about sharing my views. And therefore, when we talked about working together and the role of the National Security Advisor, it struck me it was entirely possible that we could work together, and that issues of his character would not adversely affect the decision-making on national security issues.
But you were wrong.
Not to say I was naive. I don't think I was naive, and I thought it could be, as many others did who came to work for the administration, that it could be made successful. Now, the book really is the story of whether that turned out to be true or not.
Obstruction of justice is perhaps your most serious charge against Trump. You talked about several episodes where he expressed a willingness to halt criminal investigations to, in effect, give personal favors to dictators he liked, to the Turkish leader Recep Tayyip Erdogan, even to Xi Jinping. Anyone else?
Well, I think these were the most obvious, but the whole concept of dealing, for example, with Vladimir Putin, as if the assertions of our intelligence services were the moral equivalent of what Putin said on behalf of Russia, was another aspect of it. And I felt that this was an extremely serious defect in Trump's performance on the investigations of Hawk Bank, ZTE, Huawei, and others. I spoke with the counsel to the president, spoke with the attorney general. Really, that's their domain to take a look at. And I say in the book that they were troubled by it. This is the Ukraine case that everybody's familiar with. Was the kind of last issue that I dealt with before I resigned. It's become the most famous. But my point really was it was only one in a series.
Trump's pattern, you said, looked like obstruction of justice as a way of life, which you said we couldn't accept. But you did accept it for 17 months, didn't you? Why so long?
Well, you know, a pattern by definition is something that doesn't emerge all at once. And the personal dilemma that anybody in a senior position faces is the knowledge that you're not going to prevail on every issue. I like to say I was the national security advisor, not the national security decision maker. In each of these cases, as they came up, I had conversations with others in the administration. I certainly didn't feel that I was alone in my view of the seriousness of these issues. But I think it's a very personal decision to try and decide when finally you have to resign versus whether you can keep doing what you're trying to do because of the issues presented.
You say you shared your concerns about this pattern of obstruction with key members of Trump's inner team, the Attorney General Bill Barr, Secretary of State Mike Pompeo. You say Barr told you he was very worried about the appearances Trump was creating. Just the appearances? Is that all that worried him?
Well, look, the reason I informed him and the White House counsel, Pat Cipollone and others, was because they're the ones responsible for enforcing the legal guidelines and boundaries.
Which they didn't do. Which they didn't do, did they?
Why don't you let me finish for a second? It's not my job to be the prosecutor. It's my job to tell the people whose responsibility it is what I was seeing and let them decide what to do. The fact that I didn't know what they were doing didn't surprise me. And the fact is, we don't know what yet may be going on. You know, it's very easy for somebody who's never been in this kind of circumstance to just announce their moral purity and stand out and virtue signal. My view is that that in service to the country, that there are a lot of factors to be taken into account, and the duty that one owes to the Constitution faced with this kind of president isn't simply to make yourself feel good by issuing virtuous pieties, but really more by trying to get the right thing done. So to take the example of Ukraine, my focus was on getting the security assistance to Ukraine that Trump was holding up to get that delivered. And that finally succeeded, as it turned out, the day after I resigned. But that is the focus, I think, that in my job was my responsibility. I told several members of the NSC staff to speak to the lawyers, to told them what we had seen, and they did that. That fulfilled their responsibilities. And I thought that was the proper course.
The officials you alerted to Trump's obstruction of justice, what conclusion did you draw from their lack of any substantive reaction, that Trump had successfully corrupted the government machine and made it lie for him?
Well, I think it's pretty evident that that the number of people inside the government who were willing to challenge Trump on a number of these issues has diminished over time. Now, let me be clear. The president holds the constitutional responsibility. You can like that or not like that, but the Constitution's very clear. If you don't want to carry out an order, the responsible thing to do is to resign. And if others in the government are not carrying out their responsibilities, that's a matter for them and their conscience and how they see their job.
What is it about dictators and despots that Trump so admires? Did he ever tell you?
No, and I'm not a shrink. I don't psychoanalyze people. I think others like to do that, and God bless them if that's what they want to do. I think that Trump, in a sense, envied the Xi Jinpings and the Vladimir Putins. He liked talking to big guys. Big guys get together and they do big guy things. I think it was that simplistic. I didn't see any evidence of a relationship that would be improper or constitute undue influence. I just think that was part of Trump's simplistic view of relations with foreign leaders, especially authoritarian foreign leaders.
Let's take the North Korean leader, Kim Jong-un. You were present at 2 out of 3 meetings between Trump and Kim. You said there were times when we were very close to making concessions that I think even prior administrations like the Clinton and Obama administrations wouldn't have made. Was Trump willing to give away the shop? What kinds of concessions do you mean?
Well, I don't think he understood what he was doing. I think he longed for a deal with North Korea on the nuclear weapons program. I don't think he studied the issue closely enough to know what the ramifications of different terms that were offered were. I think ultimately in the case of the Hanoi summit, the second meeting where he did walk away from a proposal by North Korea that I thought entirely inadequate. He did so because he knew that if he were to have accepted it, it would have produced a volcanic political reaction in America from the Republican Party, and that he fundamentally couldn't do that. And that really was the sort of reaction that troubled me the most, that he didn't approach North Korea or much else on the basis of philosophy or grand strategy or policy. He approached it on the basis of what was politically beneficial to him. Now, look, every Democratic politician in whatever country takes politics into account in their decision making. It goes with the territory. It's not only not something to be surprised at, it would be surprising if they didn't take politics into account. The difference with Trump is qualitative. It's not just a factor in decision making on serious issues. Sometimes it seemed to me to be essentially the only factor he took into account.
A lot has been made of Trump's supine attitude to Vladimir Putin, his unwillingness to raise difficult issues like election interference. Is Trump scared of him?
I don't think he's scared of him. And at Helsinki, to be clear, Putin himself said at the lunch after the one-on-one meeting the two of them had, that it was Trump who had raised the election interference issue. I think it's very important for people who observe Trump, who have to make decisions on whether to vote for him, or people who report on him to be accurate in their criticisms. There's plenty to criticize, but when people stretch beyond what they need to make the criticism, it doesn't strengthen the case against Trump. It weakens it. It emboldens many of his supporters to say we're victims of a conspiracy by the press or whatever, fake news, hoaxes, that sort of thing. So when you have Vladimir Putin saying that Trump raised the election interference issue at the Helsinki summit, I think that's worth taking into account. If you want to criticize Trump,
if you believe it,
criticize him all you want. I did, but be accurate about it.
There are no detailed records, according to the Washington Post, no detailed records from 5 of Trump's meetings with Putin since taking office. And that on at least one occasion in Hamburg in 2017, he asked for the interpreter's notes and ordered him to say nothing about the discussion, which does indicate, doesn't it, that Trump had something to hide from these discussions?
I don't know what it indicates. I wasn't in the government in 2017. I can tell you in the case of the Helsinki meeting, NSC staff did speak with our interpreter and got a pretty complete readout of what the two leaders discussed, which turned out to be mostly on Syria, mostly Putin talking. I think that Trump is very mistrustful of not only the bureaucracy as a whole, but even his own staff. I think it reflects the way he did business in the Trump organization. And I think one of his problems as president is that he still hasn't fully appreciated what it means to be president of the United States, as opposed to the head of the Trump organization.
How credible is Trump's claim not to have been briefed about reports that the Russians paid the Taliban to kill American soldiers? You were National Security Advisor in March last year when this information apparently surfaced.
Well, there have been press reports to that effect, and, you know, press reports are sometimes wrong, and in any event, I have said repeatedly, I'm not going to comment on that because it does involve intelligence. I can say with respect to the information reported about this issue in 2020 that it's surprising to me that it wasn't briefed to the president. The administration itself has apparently said it was in the presidential daily brief during my 17 months at the White House. I never saw any evidence that the president read the PDB. And in terms of whether or not it was briefed to him, I've said, and I think it's important for people to understand that I agreed with Susan Rice, who has written an op-ed where she said if she were National Security Advisor and that information had come to her attention, she'd have gone in to the Oval Office and told Barack Obama, and I like to think I would have done the same.
Do you buy the story which has been put out by your successor as National Security Advisor, Robert O'Brien, who said the president's career CIA briefer decided not to brief him about this because it was unverified intelligence? She made that call, and I think she made the right call. Does the system work like that?
Well, it didn't work like that when I was there, nor did it work like that under my predecessor, H.R. McMaster, at least as I understand it. The issue when you only provide an oral briefing to the president twice a week is how much are you going to try and squeeze in a limited amount of time, and that's usually discussed at a preliminary meeting right before going in to see the president with the director of national intelligence, the director of the CIA, the briefer of the time, and myself. You know, it would be better if the president read the materials and studied them more carefully. I think that that written materials tend to be a more efficient way to convey information. Certainly, the president's always free to ask questions, and that's to be encouraged. But it's despite what some advisors to the president have said, he does not consume as much intelligence as he should.
Let's talk, if we may, about the 2018 murder of the Saudi journalist Jamal Khasogghi by Saudi operatives in Istanbul. October the 15th that year, Trump decided to stand by the Saudi leadership and even wrote their excuse for them, suggesting it was a rogue operation. But it wasn't a rogue operation, was it?
Well, you know, I'm not going to get into the intelligence that the United States had on that. I can say the president decided that he was going to stand by the Saudis, and because of the importance of the relationship, that position, I think, was in a way verified by Vladimir Putin in a conversation I had with him in Moscow, who said, look, if you don't want to sell weapons to the Saudis, you don't have to. I'd be happy to sell it to them.
Is that what it really comes down to? Who's going to be able to sell weapons to whom? You gave a free pass to a government that brazenly chops up its political opponents in other people's countries, and not just to the Saudis, but to every other state the US does big business with that tortures and murders its own people. Doesn't that worry you?
Well, you know, as Winston Churchill said, if the devil were to have opposed Adolf Hitler, he would have found it in his heart to offer a kind word to Satan on the floor of the House of Commons. You don't always get to pick who your allies are in a difficult, unstable part of the world. Nobody in the administration condoned what happened to Khashoggi. There's no question about it. But we live in a harsh world.
You live in a world where I wonder how many of the untold masses jailed for having opinions in Saudi Arabia and other despotic states that the US befriends would go along with your statement that the greatest hope for freedom of mankind is the US. If a country that can finesse Mr. Khashoggi's murder is the best hope for mankind's freedom, then God help mankind, no?
Well, look, you're entitled to your opinions. I'm glad and proud to be an American citizen. There isn't any country in the world that has done more to protect human freedom than the United States, period, close quote.
Let's talk about Iran, if we may. So many bad deals to kill, you once wrote, so little time. The one that you really had in your sights over many years was the Iran nuclear deal, wasn't it? Unenforceable.
You bet it was.
Unenforceable, you called it, unverifiable and inadequate in duration and scope. But you wanted to kill that deal with nothing to put in its place over the objections of key members of Israel's military and intelligence staff who regard Iran as their #1 adversary. Many of them didn't see it your way, did they?
Well, I think you have it wrong about Israel. I think support for the U.S. getting out of the Iran nuclear deal in Israel is overwhelming. You may have noticed some things are happening in Iran. Their centrifuge assembly plant at Natanz apparently had a severe accident that they've not revealed fully. There are other explosions going on around the country. I don't know who's doing it, but I'm glad somebody's doing it. I don't know whether it's the precursor to taking down the entire nuclear weapons and ballistic missile program in Iran, but it certainly is a step in that direction. The fact is, I don't trust the Ayatollahs and the regime. I think they consistently withheld information from international inspectors. They lied about the nature of the program for 20 plus years until they were caught time and time again in those lies. I don't think they ever made a strategic decision to give up nuclear weapons. And I think the U.S. decision to pull out of the deal caught them by surprise and left them in a very difficult position. It's a hugely unpopular regime in Iran, and hopefully the day will come when the Ayatollahs are swept into the dustbin of history.
If we can just go back to Ukraine, you decided not to give testimony at the House impeachment hearing. You didn't like the way the Democrats handled the process. You called it impeachment malpractice. If you thought the president was abusing his power, wasn't it more important to get that out than worrying about procedural issues?
Isn't it more important to get a result? Again, you're back in the virtue signaling, posturing mode of politics, and that's just not the way I do things. The Democratic malpractice, which is what it was, left the situation worse than it was before the impeachment. Why? Because the way they conducted the impeachment in a very partisan fashion essentially guaranteed a partisan outcome. And the outcome was that the Senate acquitted Trump. So the impeachment advocates said that by the House action of impeaching the president, he will be deterred from engaging in the kind of conduct we saw in Ukraine. But they had no way of getting 2/3 of the Senate to vote to convict. So having acquitted Trump, they not only did not deter him, they empowered him. They removed the impeachment guardrail. This is a huge mistake. By publishing this book, what I've done is to try and lay the facts out before the real judges, not Congress, but the American people. We have an election in 4 months. The American people will speak. I trust their judgment more than Congress.
But the election isn't a substitute for the constitutional provisions for removing a president from office.
The election,
those provisions belong to,
what do you think elections are? What do you think elections are if they're not the principal constitutional path to doing just that? Impeachment has occurred 4 times in American history, and no president has ever been convicted. Only Nixon resigned. And what distinguishes the Watergate impeachment proceeding from the 3 that failed, Andrew Johnson, Bill Clinton, and Donald Trump? The Democrats worked in Watergate with Republicans. Sam Ervin of North Carolina worked with Howard Baker of Tennessee, and they produced a growing feeling on a bipartisan basis that Nixon had to go. By ignoring that relatively recent precedent, the Democrats guaranteed the outcome we got. And this is I think a very fundamental point about democratic theory. The principal way you remove presidents is by elections, not by impeachment.
We're 4 months away from the next of those elections. What if Trump loses by a small margin? Do you expect him to go quietly or organize some kind of bizarre national emergency to try and stay where he is?
Well, maybe you would tell me what evidence you have that he's planning to create a bizarre national emergency. You know,
well, he told supporters in Arizona, didn't he, that the vote will be the most corrupt election in the history of our country, and we cannot let this happen.
So you're making the same mistake as many Trump critics. You're exaggerating without adequate evidence. And
I'm asking a question.
I know from your questions, you obviously despise Trump. That's fine. I understand that. But the way you're approaching it makes it difficult for those of us who are opposed to him getting another term to make the case to Americans who want to know what the facts are. That's something that, you know, the people will decide here in 4 months, and we'll see what the outcome is. Before you get hyperthyroid about it, let's see what happens.
John Bolton, thanks very much for being on Conflict Zone.
I enjoyed it.